are up for grabs.
No, I came from North Carolina. I was just in North Carolina. Near Asheville for a wedding. Oh, were you? You know, I grew up weddings or? No, not my wedding. No, I grew up 30 miles from Asheville. Oh, really? That's where I grew up. It's a beautiful area. It's a beautiful area. It's kind of boring, but very, very beautiful. Really pretty. It was called Blackington. And there so many times I did that.
Yeah. Hey, Pete, let me call you back. I saw it said 5 o'clock. I'll call you. All right, bye. My London contact.
Okay. Yeah.
Speech.
Can everybody turn their silencer on, their telephone?
18, actually. It's nice to go back there.
Before we get started, can everybody turn their ringers off their phone? Put it on silent mode, please. You guys will tell me when I should start.
One.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those of you who are joining us via live stream from Seoul, Europe, and points east. My name is Michael Maya. I'm the director of the IBA's North America office, and I want to welcome all of you to the rollout of a report on crimes against humanity in North Korean detention centers. I should mention that the report can be accessed on the IBA website and also the HRNK website. And for those of you here physically here in DC, there should be a barcode that you can easily access the report from. It's customary these days to issue content warnings, and I have to say today's content certainly merits that. I just want to be very, very clear to all of you here and also who are live streaming that you'll be hearing about some fairly ghoulish acts: torture, infanticide, forced abortions, murder, rape, starvation. The list is unfortunately quite lengthy. In particular, the 12-minute documentary we'll be seeing shortly contains some fairly graphic descriptions about abuse to which detention center survivors were subjected to, and it's very strong. I mean, I've seen it a dozen times, and each time I find it deeply affecting. Before we play the documentary, I want to recognize a handful of individuals who played very important roles in this inquiry. If you were to look at the report itself, we have 3 pages of acknowledgments, which gives you some sense of how many people actually worked very, very hard to make this possible. I deeply regret that I can't actually mention each of those individuals by name, but I just want to touch on a handful of people who were especially active. First, I'd like to thank the executive director of HRNK, Greg Scarlatti. He couldn't be here, unfortunately, had a teaching obligation at the State Department that he couldn't get out of, and he deeply regrets not being here with us. We, and by we I mean the IBA and HRNK, enjoyed an absolutely astoundingly productive collegial relationship, and that's thanks to Greg's leadership and also to his incredible staff, many of whom are here with us today. We're delighted that HRNK's co-emeritus Roberta Cohen will be joining us as a speaker via live stream, and she's probably a household name for anybody who follows North Korean human rights, as you probably know. Next, I'd like to thank the 4 renowned judges who oversaw the inquiry. First, Navi Pillay, who served as the chair and is joining us from Geneva. She's got a very busy schedule and took time to join us for today's 90-minute session. Silvia Fernandez is joining us from The Hague, and we're very fortunate to have Wolfgang Schomburg, who arrived very late last night from Germany, to be with us today. And our 4th judge, Dame Sylvia Cartwright from New Zealand, unfortunately could not be with us today. I should say that these 4 judges are an all-star panel of judges. I mean, these are some of the most accomplished judges living today. They've literally shaped the international criminal law as we know it today through their decisions and their activities over the last handful of decades. Next, I'd like to recognize the efforts of Debevoise and Plimpton, which contributed 2,000 hours. Anybody who's worked at a law firm knows what 2,000 hours of pro bono time means. That's a colossal contribution. It's certainly the very, very largest pro bono contribution the IBA has ever received in its 75-year history. Nawi, I'm indebted to you and your colleagues forever. A dozen lawyers from Debevoise, lawyers and actually paralegals participated in this project. First, I'd like to thank lead partner Natalie Reed. Natalie, if you're listening, thank you very much for everything you've done. Nawi, who's also with us here today and who worked tirelessly on this project. And last but not least, Sarah Lee and Moon Cha, who, among other things, examined witnesses, North Korean witnesses, at the March hearing in fluent Korean, which you can imagine must have been a comfort to the Korean witnesses who are testifying about very sensitive issues. Next, I'd like to thank the members of the IBA War Crimes Committee for everything they've done. We couldn't have done this without the committee's central role. Two of its members, Greg Kehoe and Kirsty Sutherland, helped present evidence at the live hearing alongside the Debevoise team, which included, obviously, Nawi as well. Next, I'd like to recognize two IBA colleagues for their assistance. First, I'd like to recognize my DC-based colleague, the incomparable Ashna Basnet, who played such a key role in this inquiry. Ashna, can you please raise your hand? Thank you for everything you've done, Ashna. Next, I'd like to also thank the Executive Director of the IBA, Mark Ellis, who supported this inquiry from the outset out of the London office. And as many of you know, Mark is actually a deeply respected expert on atrocity crimes. Another deeply respected expert on atrocity crimes is David Tolbert. And many of you know David. He helped us spearhead the entire inquiry from day one. And frankly, we wouldn't be here today without all of David's efforts. So thank you, David. I'd like to thank also the many experts who provided oral and written testimony for the inquiry. They included satellite imagery expert Joe Bermudez, Nicholas Eberstadt and Ken Gause, both experts on the workings of the North Korean regime. Ben Rogers, a renowned expert on the persecution of Christians, not only in North Korea, but worldwide. And you'll hear him in the documentary shortly. And then Roberta Cohn, who I mentioned shortly a while ago, who testified about the tactical use of starvation in the detention centers. I also want to thank the remarkable Michael Kirby, who provided expert testimony at the hearing and, of course, chaired the landmark UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. And the only reason any of us is sitting here today is because of the fine work that Michael Kirby and his team did back in 2013 and 2014. Finally, and most importantly, I want to recognize the more than 50 North Korean escapees who participated actively in this inquiry by providing written testimony, oral testimony. It took enormous courage for them to come forward. Lots of escapees still cannot speak about this openly in public, or perhaps for fear of retribution against their family members who still remain in North Korea. And this entire inquiry is dedicated to them and all the suffering they've endured, and also to the survivors who are still there in North Korea and have not made it out. With that, I'd like to play the 12-minute version of a documentary that the very gifted documentarian Malachi Gillihan directed and produced. And once again, just a repeat of the content warning. This is not probably the most graphic documentary you'll ever see, but it does merit a warning of sorts. So with that, if we can hit play on the documentary.
The protection of human dignity and rights are clearly proclaimed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in the UN General Assembly in 1948. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
체포돼가지고 제가 정말 별의별 고문을 다 받았습니다. 물고문, 전기고문, 구타도 당했고 거꾸로 매달리는 고문, 잠 안 재우는 고문, 정말 말로 표현할 수 없는 고문을 별의별 고문을 다 당했고
기절했는데 기절한 사람을 그 떡구로다가 이 머리를 구타했는데 어떻게 했는지 전 기절했으니까 뭐 어떻게 맞았는지는 몰라요. 근데 제가 정신 차려서 보니까 머리가 너무 뻐근해서 만져보니까 이런 혹이 이 이마에 나 있었고 그날 저녁에 자고 깨나니까 이 귀에서 피가 흘러서 이 바닥에 피가 엄청 많이 고여 있었거든요.
그래서 기호가 우선은 자기 실컷 때리고 이제 들어가라 하는 경우에는 내가 아무리 맞았어도 이게 지금 철창인데요. 들어가라 하면 그 자리에서 두세 걸음 하고 알았습니다 하고 대답하는 이 말을 거두 못합니다. 이 말을 땅에다 찌야 됩니다. 소리가 안 나면 불합격입니다. 알았습니다 하는데 알았습니다. 쾅 소리가 나면 들어갈 수 있지만 소리가 안 나면 4번, 5번, 10번 계속 반복습니다. 이 앞머리를 내 스스로가 바닥에 찔 때까지 쾅 알았습니다.
No other country in the contemporary world besides North Korea perpetuates such gross and systematic human rights violations.
Inquiries, even if the prospects of a prosecution seem to be very distant or remote, are extremely important to establish facts. Even that alone is very, very important for victims, because also inquiries, they give this voice to victims, this possibility for them to share their suffering, to understand that someone is listening to them.
우리 동네에 들어갔을 때 그 옆에 감방에 남자 하나는 너무 맞고 체절을 당하고 하니까 자기 전으로 이런 데다 머리 박고 죽었어요. 자살했어. 그래서 이 벽에 막 피가 다 묻어 있고, 예, 그 피가 안 지더라고요. 그 애들이 그렇게 가다나니까 자살해 죽느라고 제가 정말 이 손목도 5-6번 꺼냈고, 뭐 약도 먹었고, 목도 매봤고.
When you have a system that is inflicting this inhumane treatment on individuals over a significant period of time, when that happens, wherever it happens, the international community has got to pay attention. Because the opposite side of the coin is, when do you start paying attention?
그 엄청난 노동 과제로 인해 가지고 많은 수감자들이 영양실조로 죽었습니다. 제가 제 손으로 묻은 수감자들만 수백 명이 됩니다.
The amount of suffering and the abuse is just staggering. I've seen a lot of atrocities. I've seen terrible things. But North Korea takes the cake. I mean, it's some of the worst crimes that's ever happened in the world, in the history of the world.
I did not learn about the Holocaust until I was 10 years old. And my Sunday school teacher happened to be a Holocaust survivor. And it was only at that point that I learned that 30 or 40 family members had been killed in Auschwitz. And I remember as a child thinking, how is it that the world knew about the concentration camps and did nothing?
제가 그리고 고루장에서 정말 열이 세게 나서 이렇게 눈도 이렇게 뜰 수가 없었거든요. 그래서 그 약을 좀 달라고 했어요. 약을 달라고 했는데 약을 안 줬거든요. 너가 사람이라고 약을 먹겠다고 하나 하면서 약을 안 줘가지고 저는
Amongst all the litany of terrible human rights atrocities that the North Korean regime is committing, Christians are particularly targeted, and North Korea is probably the worst place in the world to be a Christian. And Christians, if they're found to be practicing their religion, if they possess a Bible, if they're found to be meeting together to pray or to worship, they almost certainly will be arrested. They'll end up in prison camps, subjected to severe torture, And in some cases, Christians have been executed.
These crimes could not be taking place except pursuant to a state policy of which there's knowledge going up the entire chain of command, all the way up to Kim Jong-un.
To me, it's stunning that we know all the facts we need to know that people are suffering. Scores of people, I'm talking about millions of people. And the amount of energy that's being exerted to bring that to a close is minute.
그것에서 그러한 고통들을 참고 견디면서 견딜 수 있었던 그런 가장 큰 이유 중에 하나는 나는 나를 사람이라고 생각하지 않았습니다. 앞에 있은 게오는 인간이고 나는 이걸 짐승이라고 생각하자. 나 자신을 그러지 않고서는 이걸 사람이 분노, 이 모든 이 수치, 이런 몸에 감 내가 견디기 힘들기 때문에 나는 태어날 때 자체 이게 짐승으로 태어나 개나 돼지나 다름없다고 생각하면 분노도 없고 의식도 없고 그 생각을 계속 맞으면서 그 생각을 계속했습니다. 나는 짐승이라고 생각하자.
So thousands of people have gone through this system, and they have been inflicted with this kind of maltreatment for decades. Do we wait another 3 decades for that? Do we need another several thousands and thousands of people in order for someone to pay attention? Or is there a time when you take a stand and you say, no, this should stop and has to stop?
We have had irrefutable evidence of forced abortions and infanticide.
누군가가 밖에서 들어와서 저의 시름 구원치는 소리를 듣고 누군가가 들어와서 저를 구원해 주지 않으면 저는 살아날 수가 없는 상황이었습니다. 결국 저는 당하고 말았습니다. 그때 당한 성폭행으로 인해서 저는 임신되었습니다. 다짜고짜 산부인과 데려가서 마취도 없이 강제 낙태를 하였습니다. 보험이 없습니다.
This is a widespread pattern. These are not isolated cases.
I mean, these are the types of things you don't see even in war zones and in other continents. This is, in some respects, unique to North Korea.
The situation we have in North Korea is completely different. That's forcible abortion. It's forcible taking away of life. And this is what is a crime. It's a crime against humanity for that to happen.
The international community, through international organizations, in particular through the UN, must find ways to seek accountability.
The criminal acts that you'll hear about in these prisons to enforce this repression fall into a multitude of categories, Your Honor, that come within the crime against humanity set forth in the Rome Statute. Torture, beatings, electric shock, starvation, sleep deprivation, punishment cells, solitary confinement, and enslavement. People being put to work in the elements for long periods of time from the early morning hours to late at night. Even children. Forced enslavement of even children. Extrajudicial and arbitrary executions and murders. The witnesses have said that murders that take place in these detention centers are frequent, ongoing, and they fall into multitudes, not individuals. As a matter of fact, witnesses have talked about the murders of infants. Infants that are born in the prison and are put to death by the prison guards. And lest we not mention this and emphasize this enough, the actual sexual violence that takes place on a continuous basis in these institutions.
When the government is unable or unwilling to investigate or to listen to what has happened to thousands of victims, then institutions such as this quasi-judicial tribunal, listening to evidence of what is going on now, what has happened before and what is going on now, are crucially important. In this panel, we have my 3 colleagues who are renowned international judges with huge experience. And ultimately, we are judges. We listen to the evidence. We have to be satisfied that it could reasonably be true. So we are technicians. We examine that evidence, and what we come up with is independent assessments from our judicial background. And that gives a tribunal such as this, a quasi-judicial tribunal, status.
People should never stop believing in the power of justice and the power of law. The day will come that also those being protected by their power, they will be brought to justice.
This is a very important step in the process to seek accountability for the crimes committed in the DPRK. Accountability is a real fact. There are many other despots who wouldn't have imagined that they would be the subject of an actual investigation by an international body. What is the message sent to Kim Jong-un and other despots? That they cannot get away with this. No dictatorship lasts forever. The day of reckoning will come.
The documentary you saw, as it's mentioned at the trail end of the documentary, is available on the IBA website and also the HRNK website, and will soon be available on YouTube. And we encourage all of you to transmit it as much as you can. It will be translated into Korean so that the South Korean population can watch it, and perhaps even north of South Korea. I'd like to now turn things over to the chair of the inquiry, Judge Navi Pillay, who's joining us from Geneva. Judge Pillay is the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the former president of the Rwanda Tribunal, and a former judge on the International Criminal Court. Do we have Navi Pillay lined up?
Thank you. May I begin?
Hi, Judge Pillay.
So let me begin by thanking my esteemed fellow judges, two of whom you will hear from this morning, as well as the organizers of this inquiry, the IBA, its War Crimes Committee, and HRNK. I would also like to recognize the extraordinary work of Deborah and Plimpton, pro bono counsel of this inquiry, which has devoted countless pro bono hours to this inquiry. This has truly been an extraordinary group effort from start to finish. And may I also recognize Malaki Gillian for producing this excellent documentary that we just saw. It should be disseminated widely. In particular, the stories of the escapees in the documentary deserve to be heard, and heard widely. I have great admiration for the many North Korean escapees who came forward to provide testimony for this inquiry, as it was essential to write this authoritative report. We as judges know how much courage it takes to come forward and speak about the horrors one has endured. The international community owes it to North Korean escapees to provide opportunities like this inquiry to tell their experiences and to help document crimes while their memories are relatively fresh. I would now like to provide a brief history of recent efforts to shine light on human rights abuses in North Korea. During my tenure as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2008 to 2014, the UN Human Rights Council established the UN Commission of Inquiry, or COI, to investigate systematic, widespread, and grave violations of human rights in North Korea. And in the words of Michael Kirby, the chair of that COI, this was an opportunity, he said, to shine light in a very dark corner of the world. When Michael Kirby and his two commissioners reported on the inquiry's findings at the UN General Assembly, the member states reacted with extreme shock and with near unanimous condemnation of North Korea. The report included descriptions of systematic and widespread human rights violations, including murder, torture, sexual violence, enforced disappearances, and persecution, especially of Christians. Michael Kirby's report clearly stated that the acts of Kim Jong-un and others who oversee North Korea's detention centers and prisons amounted to crime against humanity under the Rome Statute, which give rise to the International Criminal Court. He went on to recommend that they be investigated by the International Criminal Court or perhaps an ad hoc tribunal akin to the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, where Judge Schomburg was a judge at the ICTY and David Tolbert was the deputy prosecutor and I was on the ICTR. I would like also to make quick mention of North Korea's prison camps before I say more about the focus of this inquiry, which is detention centers. Some of you may know that I chaired IBA's 2017 inquiry on crimes against humanity in North Korean political prisons. A fellow judge in that inquiry, Judge Thomas Bergenthal, himself a child survivor of Auschwitz, stated that the conditions in North Korean political prisoners were as inhumane and horrific, or even worse, than what he had experienced in Nazi concentration camps or anything he had seen in his long, distinguished career in the human rights field. To be clear, the abuses to which those in North Korean detention centers are subjected are every bit as horrific and macabre as those in political prisons. In some cases, they are worse, because interrogators at detention centers regularly employ extreme acts of torture to extract forced confessions, which become less necessary once people are in the political prisons. As you will hear today, this inquiry has added to the mountain of evidence that crimes against humanity continue to be committed in North Korean detention centers. This report drew on a range of sources, including sworn testimony from dozens of former detainees who now live mostly in South Korea, renowned experts, scholarly materials, satellite images, and an affidavit from Tai Young-ho, a former North Korean deputy ambassador to the UK and one of North Korea's highest ranking defectors. Arguably, he understands the inner workings of the Kim regime better than any person outside of North Korea. Other speakers this morning will elaborate on Kim Jong-un's culpability under international law pursuant to the principle of command responsibility. But I am reminded of the expert testimony of Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt at the live hearing in March this year. Dr. Eberstadt testified that North Korea is, I quote, perhaps the most perfectly totalitarian command and control structure on the planet today. Why is this important? Because it strengthens the argument that very little happens in North Korea that Kim Jong-un does not explicitly or implicitly approve of. To be clear, one of the reasons my fellow judges and I unanimously concluded that there is a reasonable basis to conclude that Kim Jong-un has committed 10 out of the 11 crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. And it's precisely because we are confident that he and those who report to him are aware of the crimes. They have knowledge of the crimes being committed in North Korean detention centers. If I and everyone who worked on this inquiry know about these crimes, what are the chances that Kim Jong-un does not? As the report makes clear, these crimes include rape, infanticide, forced abortions, torture, starvation, and summary executions. I should emphasize that Christians are singled out, especially for brutal treatment, and are disproportionately represented in North Korea's detention centers and its political prisons as well. So, How is it that the international community possesses virtually irrefutable evidence that the Kim regime is committing such crimes and yet has failed to take meaningful action? Further, how is it possible that the international community has not unanimously condemned the active participation of other states in these crimes? For example, there is ample evidence that China regularly repatriates North Korean escapees in violation of the international law principle of non-refoulement. For those of you unfamiliar with the principle of non-refoulement, it requires that states not return a refugee or asylum seeker to a territory where they may be exposed to persecution. We know, and China surely knows, that China's repatriation of Christians into North Korea amounts to a virtual death sentence, as many are tortured in detention centers before ending up in political prisons, where they eventually die from starvation, overwork, disease, executions, and being held indefinitely. Like the UN Commission of Inquiry, this inquiry hopefully will make it that much harder for the international community to continue taking no meaningful action to address the crimes against humanity being committed in North Korean detention centers. What is important about inquiries such as this is that they advance the process of holding perpetrators accountable and delivering justice to victims through the collection of evidence and indisputable facts. We don't have a crystal ball, so we can't say when the evidence we have gathered will be used in a court of law or some quasi-judicial process, but I am very confident that that day will come. Let us not forget that the Cambodia tribunal was established roughly 20 years after the Khmer Rouge's worst abuses. And in fact, one of my fellow judges, Silvia Cartwright, played a key role as a judge on that tribunal. Let me say a few words about the types of detention centers we focused on in this inquiry, which often serve as way station to long-term imprisonment. At the outset, I want to emphasize that a large number of North Koreans are detained for acts that settled international law or any right-thinking person would not recognize as legitimate offenses, such as practicing Christianity, or watching K-pop videos, or South Korean soap operas. The three types of detention centers that we focused on in this inquiry were pre-trial detention centers, Kuryo-yang, holding centers, Yip Kyul-so, and labor training camps, Rodong Danryun Dai. These three are operated by state security agencies that investigate and punish supposed threats to the country's leadership, that is, so-called enemies of the state, or, quote, evil seeds. There are two state entities that run these three types of detention centers, and to be very clear, the chain of command for both these state entities traces its way up to Kim Jong-un. First, the Ministry of State Security, or MSS, plays a key role in managing both political prisons and detention facilities located primarily on the China-North Korea border. There, North Korea holds individuals who have been arrested for illegal border crossings and what the regime calls grave crimes, such as possessing foreign media content or being in contact with Christian churches in China. The second entity, the Ministry of People's Security, or MPS, oversees the investigation of non-political crimes and holds and interrogates suspects in detention centers, after which many are transferred to labor training camps. Because time is short, I would like to close by briefly mentioning a few of the recommendations we make in this report, which you can find on pages 15 and 16. Criminal prosecutions. Under international law, states have an obligation to prosecute perpetrators of crimes against humanity. The goals of international criminal justice include deterrence, punishment, the establishment of the historical record, and the empowerment of victims. Surveys of North Korean defectors reveal a strong preference to see those responsible for crimes against humanity to be held criminally accountable. Options include 1, prosecutions before the International Criminal Court, or 2, the creation of an ad hoc international tribunal, or 3, domestic prosecutions and the exercise of universal jurisdiction. National criminal courts have an important role to play in ensuring accountability for international crimes through their exercise of universal jurisdiction, which my fellow judge Silvia Fernandez will touch on shortly. Secondly, ensuring North Korea's compliance with UN human rights treaties to which it is a party. The DPRK has ratified the ICCPR, ICESCR, CEDAW, and CRC, all of which require the humane treatment of individuals. The report calls on North Korea to comply with its treaty obligations. More importantly, we call on the UN Security Council to adopt a resolution demanding that North Korea do so, based on the overwhelming evidence that North Korea continues to violate its treaty obligations by maintaining a detention system in which murder, extermination, enslavement, imprisonment, torture, rape, and persecution are commonplace. Targeted sanctions for people responsible for crimes against humanity is another of our recommendations. The UN Security Council has yet to implement the recommendation suggested in both the UN Commission of Inquiry and the IBA's 2017 inquiry on political prisons that countries adopt carefully targeted, coordinated, and multilateral sanctions against persons they identify as being responsible for crimes against humanity in North Korea. This needs to happen once and for all. In conclusion, my fellow judges and I believe we have heard overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity in North Korean detention centers. During the March hearing in Washington, D.C., 3 of the 4 inquiry judges, myself included, sat several feet away from survivors of North Korean detention centers as they testified about crimes they observed or had been subjected to. We found them highly credible witnesses. We also heard from one of the world's leading satellite imagery experts and others with deep expertise on North Korean human rights abuses, including Michael Kirby, who also provided testimony. And as our report makes clear, we believe there is a reasonable basis to conclude that crimes against humanity have been and continue to be committed in North Korea, not only by Kim Jong-un, but also by senior regime officials and also lower-level state actors who carry out some of the worst abuses in North Korea's detention centers. Since World War II, there is ample precedent for holding senior, mid-level, and even low-level actors accountable for the commissions of crimes against humanity. This inquiry, coupled with the UN Commission of Inquiry and the IBA's previous inquiry on political prisons, should put North Korean officials up and down the chain of command on notice that they will one day be held accountable for their actions. The very last thing I wish to say is that in my experience, nothing ever happens with respect to human rights abuses unless civil society pushes for relief. And so I exhort civil society organizations to advocate at the national and international level for immediate steps to address North Korea's 75-year-old human rights disaster. As my colleague Greg Kehoe said in the documentary, are we going to wait a few more decades to do something about this disaster? The answer must be a resounding no. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Pillay, for your remarks. Next, we'll be hearing from Judge Silvia Fernandez, who's joining us from The Hague. Judge Fernandez was the former president, also known as the chief judge of the International Criminal Court, and is now the president of the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And with that, we'll turn it over to Judge Fernandez.
Thank you. And I wish to start by saying that I'm honored to have participated in this commission of inquiry, which has reached the extremely important conclusion that there is a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed in detention centers in North Korea, and that states officials at the highest level may be responsible. I will now focus on the first recommendation of this commission related to criminal prosecutions, as indeed the commission has recommended a full-fledged investigation in order to collect the necessary evidence to prosecute those responsible before an appropriate tribunal. This is not an easy task, but the international community has gained considerable experience in investigating and prosecuting crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. In fact, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, the promotion of accountability for these type of crimes is one of the greatest achievements of the international community in the last 3 decades. These achievements have been made possible through a series of important measures taken by the international community since the early 90s to ensure accountability for these crimes at the international and also national level. At the international level, it is worth recalling that in 1993 and 1994, the Security Council of the United Nations took the lead by establishing the ad hoc international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda to deal with the crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide committed in those territories. The ad hoc tribunals followed the precedent of the Nuremberg Tribunal, created at the end of the Second World War to investigate and prosecute Nazi leaders. The ad hoc tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda were very effective in investigating and prosecuting these type of crimes, including through the prosecution of those most responsible at the highest level. In turn, these tribunals also paved the way for the creation of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the first permanent international criminal court established by an international treaty negotiated by the international community as a whole. This year, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Rome Statute, the founding treaty of the ICC, which is now fully operational. Like its predecessors, the ICC has also proved that investigations and prosecutions are difficult, but indeed possible, provided that there is enough cooperation from the international community. Now, the ICC has global aspirations, but can only operate within the boundaries of its founding treaty, which has not yet achieved universal participation. In accordance with this founding treaty, the ICC can only investigate in situations of atrocity crimes committed in the territory of a state party or by nationals of a state party. In other words, unless the Security Council of the United Nations refers the matter to the court, the ICC would not have jurisdiction in the current situation because North Korea is not a party to the ICC. These and other jurisdictional limitations of the ICC explain why other international or hybrid tribunals have been created even after the establishment of the ICC. Since the establishment of the ICC, the international community created other tribunals, such as the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which have been mentioned already by Judge Pillay, the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, or most recently, the Special Criminal Court for the Central African Republic. All these special international or hybrid tribunals have in common the objective of fighting impunity for the most serious international crimes. They may differ in the modalities of the creation, which may be done by treaty or other arrangements. They may also differ in the composition or applicable law. Some of these tribunals are indeed hybrid and combine international and national judges, for instance, and may apply national and international law. The form is not what matters. What matters is the conviction that crimes against humanity and other international crimes concern the international human community as a whole. They must, for these reasons, be investigated and prosecuted. After 3 decades of efforts in this regard, this is by now a well-established principle. Impunity for these crimes is not an acceptable option anymore. It is not acceptable and it is not accepted when there has not been an agreement to create a tribunal. The international community has established mechanisms to ensure at least the timely collection of evidence, to ensure that prosecution is possible at some point by an appropriate international or national jurisdiction. In this regard, it is worth mentioning the creation in 2016 of the international mechanism to assist in the investigation and prosecution of those responsible for international crimes committed in Syria since 2011, and a similar one created in 2018 to collect and preserve evidence of the most serious international crimes committed in Myanmar, also since 2011. So, as I have already said, these two mechanisms aim at the collection and preservation of evidence for future prosecution by an international or by a national tribunal on the basis of universal jurisdiction or other form of extraterritorial jurisdiction. And some proceedings are currently being conducted by national tribunals, mainly in Europe, but not exclusively. These are welcome developments, as it implies that all states of the world can and should contribute to fight impunity of these crimes. Needless to say that to be successful, these national efforts, like the international ones, require the cooperation of the international community. As I said at the beginning, today we have reached the conclusion that there is a reasonable basis to believe that international crimes have been or are being committed in detention centers of North Korea. It is thus essential to open an investigation and bring those who bear the greatest responsibility before justice. As amply demonstrated in the last 30 years, the investigation and prosecution of these crimes is possible either at the national or international level or through combined national and international efforts. For this to happen, it is necessary that the international community pays attention and contributes to international or national efforts. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Judge Fernandez. We'll now hear from Wolfgang Schomburg, who formerly served as a judge on the Rwanda Tribunal and also on the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Thank you, Chair. I intend to speak about some personal impressions from not only this inquiry, I speak about the chain of justice and some conclusions. Having heard so much evidence in international tribunals about the serious crimes committed in former Yugoslavia, and in particular the genocide in Rwanda, about 1 million people killed within 3 months. I thought nothing could make me that emotional as it did in part when we heard the live witnesses here in Washington, D.C. And among those impressions, I want to extract one testimony together and supported by other witnesses, namely that about forced abortion, and that what my dear friend Judge Pillay spoke about, and this was the repatriation of people. I think I have never heard something similar about the killing of babies and forced abortions delivered 200 times and put together in a lorry and then either found their mass graves or not. But this was really deeply moving, and it was also deeply moving because I didn't know this before. Some witnesses testified that they were able to flee from the detention center and from North Korea on their way to South Korea. And it was interesting that they all together said that at a minimum they were tortured in China, but automatically, not as it was said, repatriated. It was a forcible retransfer from China to North Korea, and they were brought again into detention centers. And there, the fate of the babies was absolutely clear, because they were told it's the policy of our country that there should be no Chinese blood in the veins of people living here. This was really shocking. It was also shocking that apparently this was a policy behind, and that apparently China and North Korea, since the beginning of the war in Korea in 1950, they are working together, I don't think on a basis of a treaty, but de facto. And this should also be recognized, and it deserves further investigation. But how did I develop myself to a judge in such a place like The Hague or in Arusha, Tanzania? First, no doubt it was that my own grandfather, having been a social democrat in Germany, was brought for political reasons by the Russians in the Soviet occupied part of Germany to a concentration camp close to Berlin, and was killed after 3 years detention, because the Russians, they extended the existence of the Nazi concentration camps, and they used them for their own purposes. And there was a lot very simply what I have heard in relation to the detention camps here. No doubt that also the Nuremberg proceedings, the first ever international contribution to bring justice to the perpetrators after World War II, had a huge impact on me, because I saw and I heard about the injustice immediately after World War II, that the crimes committed there was ignored, and there was a number of dementees in this relation, but they brought to justice the main perpetrators. It is true that unfortunately this happened only in Nuremberg. Afterwards, it was more a defense of the perpetrators by the German Supreme Court, in that they did not bring justice, but they praised and freed those indeed responsible ones. And as a judge of a former judge of the Supreme Court in Germany, I can emphasize this, that this was injustice, because in 2004 it was the German court itself declaring that the court is incredibly sorry about this abuse of power by a court. This also can happen. And yes, I, of course, closely followed the development in the Vietnam War and the development in Korea. Why this? Because numerous parallels have to be drawn between Germany and Korea at that time. We were both divided countries, and we tried and hoped to overcome this. And at that time already, there was a small institution, the Salzgitter institution, collecting evidence for the crimes committed in the eastern part of Germany, the so-called German Democratic Republic. And those refugees coming from there, they were invited to give evidence of what has happened to them and others in the detention centers. You can see numerous parallels from that, what we have heard about Korea. And this was very important, that already at that time, when nobody had hoped that there would be a reunification of Germany, this collection was available, because you all know, immediately after the fall of the wall in Berlin, the investigation started. It was explicitly told to be governmental crimes, an agency, a separate prosecutor against crimes committed by governments and its agencies. And they based the work on this collection center. And I think, I will later come back to this, it's a recommendation. You can never start early and enough and to collect evidence and bring it one step further, because I had a discussion last week with one of with the prosecutors, the chief prosecutor of this entity working on crimes committed in the former GDR, also committed crimes by judges in the GDR and in the detention center, that yes, this collection center, it was the very start, but it would have been far better if there would have been a qualified interrogation and investigation possible, and also to a certain extent declared admissible by judges, by qualified judges, because this would have made some testimonies available as evidence in court later. And I think this inquiry has contributed to this improvement of that what happened at that time. And I should not forget that immediately After this time, I was at that time the Undersecretary of State in the Berlin Department of Justice. I was approached by people from Korea asking me that prosecutors from South Korea could join the investigation teams in Berlin. And it was made possible, and they followed closely 2 to 3 years the investigation, always bearing in mind that it could be that also Korea, the entire Korea, could have out of the blue the same wonderful fate that was given to us by reunification. And I deeply hope that we will have this also in the future for Korea. I was just alerted that I have to wrap up. I apologize, Mr. President, but let me say that it's really important in a kind of chain of justice. We heard a lot about from my honorable colleagues about the development of courts. For most of you here in the room, it's kind of self-understanding that you have international tribunals. That's not true. The first one was established in 1982, only on former Yugoslavia. And beforehand, it was a permanent fight of the International Committee of the Red Cross not to have only crimes in law books, but also bring perpetrators to justice. And that is something what we have to learn. First, that crimes are committed not by states, but by human beings, by perpetrators. You have to identify the victims, but also the perpetrators. But then you have to bring justice to this concrete situation. And let me conclude by saying, all over the world, and in particular also in a country like entire Korea, there will be no peace without justice and no justice without truth. And this was our main task, to come closer to truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Schomburg. I'm one of the lucky ones who will get to pick Judge Schomburg's formidable brain over lunch today, hopefully. But thank you for your remarks. Next, we'll turn over to things over to Greg Kehoe, former co-chair of the IBA War Crimes Committee and a partner at Greenberg Traurig. As some of you know, Greg was one of the lead lawyers who helped the Iraqis prosecute Saddam Hussein, a dictator very few people ever imagined would end up being tried for his crimes. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
Well, thank you, Michael. One of the things that we tried to do with my learned colleagues was try to present a factual approach to exactly what was transpiring. And I think, as so aptly outlined by Judge Schomburg just now, what the facts presented was a vivid portrait that is analogous to Dante's Infernos and Nine Circles of Hell in describing the detention camps in North Korea. Because what we observed from the detainees' testimony was a pervasive, widespread, systematic series of crimes inflicted upon detainees, and most importantly, on a routine basis. This was not just an occasional crime that happened once a month or maybe once every 2 weeks. We are talking about systematic crime that happened on a daily basis that runs the gamut of human misery, from arbitrary executions, God forbid somebody would try to escape, enslavement, what went on every day, and we'll talk about it in a bit, was work from before sunrise until 11 to 12 o'clock at night. And even children were forced to participate under horrific conditions. It was addressed by Judge Schomburg and Judge Pillay, infanticide, well, within the murders, and we'll talk a little bit about that, what that means. We talk about what it means to murder children. Well, we'll read for you and refer to you what the detainees talked about when they talked about babies being murdered. And what was, again, routine on top of the starvation and other deprivation of rights and liberties and human necessities was torture. That the torture, again, was just routine. And let's start just, what are we talking about when we're talking about starvation? We are talking about individuals, human beings in these detention camps that are not receiving anywhere near the amount of food that they need to sustain themselves on a daily basis. On top of that, the further deprivation of food was a means of additional punishment. Witnesses testified that people in the prison camps and detention centers died of malnutrition on a daily basis, and not just one or two. Scores on a daily basis simply because they weren't being fed. And what are we talking about not being fed? The witnesses describe what people were actually being fed. Skin of potatoes and corns mixed with stones and coal. Others just got a few kernels of corn, and what they got was rotten and inedible that led to other problems, health problems, in addition to malnutrition as a result of those rotten, inedible food that they were given. And what did the inmates have to resort to? They had to resort to eating rodents, frogs if they could, snakes if they could. And there's even testimony of a detainee that she observed one individual actually eating his own body parts. When work was used as a form of punishment, if, for instance, when you were working in the horrific conditions in North Korea from dawn till 11 to midnight with children, and you did not meet your work quotas, whatever those quotas happened to be, you were punished. You were punished not only by being beaten, but being deprived by additional food. So I take you from the initial premise that people were weren't being fed sufficiently from the outset. And these weakened people didn't make their food quotas. And yet more food was denied to them as a punishment for that. We talk about beatings and torture as if that we're just turning the page and walking down the street. But when you hear what these detainees talked about the beatings and the torture, about how they were beat so badly that their bottom teeth were knocked out. They were beat so badly that they fainted from the pain through electric shock, and beaten with electric batons, and beaten with batons with nails in them. Again, on a routine basis that led to death. One witness talked to us about the classic pigeon torture, which puts apparently the most strain that a body can take, where you're hooked up and you're handcuffed behind your back and you're hooked up off the ground. And the detainees testified is the most painful torture that they endured, putting aside the waterboarding, of course, and the electric shock that took place. And lest we forget, if by chance you happen to be a practicing Christian, because if you were a practicing Christian and the individuals in the prison got a hold of that, you were in store, more punishment was in store for you. But overlay all that in addition to this malnourished torture and beatings that took place on a daily basis is what women had to undergo in these facilities on a daily basis. And that was the sexual assaults on women in these prisons. Rape, again, according to the witnesses, was routine. There was no accountability with the guards and the prison superiors, so in fact, rape took place on a daily basis. And of course, with the rapes came forced abortions. And witnesses testified that within these forced abortions, if a baby was born alive, the guards would just suffocate the baby with a piece of plastic over the face. But we talk about arbitrary executions for trying to escape. Judge Schomburg and Judge Pillay talked a little bit about infanticide. What does that mean? What does that mean? Of course, it means the killing of babies, but how does it take place? It's easy just to talk about it. It's more difficult to recognize how it took place. A baby was born to a woman in one of these detention centers. One woman testified, one of the detainees testified that the baby was just wrapped up and put out in the winter to freeze to death. Other detainees testified were just killed by the guards and thrown into a plastic bag. And woe to the woman who happened to be married to a Chinese man and had a baby. And that detainee had very poignant testimony as to what actually happened. These words are not ours. These words are not words that we just came up for drama in this. I will read to you the words of one of the detainees that my learned colleague has quoted, and the judges have quoted in their decision. It said, after the detainee delivered the healthy baby, who had been and she had been married to a Chinese man, quote, a guard grabbed the newborn baby by one leg and threw him in a large plastic-lined bag. The doctor present explained that since North Korea was short on food, the country should not have to feed the children of foreign fathers. When the box was filled with babies, it was taken outside and it was buried. That same woman testified that when she was present, when various fetuses were taken, several lived, that they were stabbed with forceps in order that they should die on the spot. How can this go on? It's been going on for a very long time. Unlike Dante's 9 circles of hell, which deal with the afterlife, what is described in this decision by these learned judges is going on right now, and it has been going on for a significant period of time. I've just gotten my notice to wrap up, which I will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We'll now hear from Nawi Ukabiala from Deva Voice in Plimpton. I should mention that Nawi took time from his very, very busy schedule in New York to come down here for the day. He's got a pressing client matter that he's working on furiously, so I'm deeply appreciative of you coming here. Nawi, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I wouldn't have wanted to miss this for the world. I'd like to begin by thanking everybody at this table for making this very important report possible, and also everybody in this room for their role in drawing attention to what is really one of the great humanitarian crises of all time. What I'm going to do is explain the organizational structure in which North Korean detention facilities exist so that everybody can start to understand how those crimes that we've just heard about can be traced to the uppermost echelons of the North Korean regime. So let's start from the ground level and work our way up. With the assistance of expert analysis by Joe Bermudez, HRNK has developed a GeoSat project that identifies many of the detention facilities in North Korea. This one is Chungsan number 11. This is an image of a forced labor training camp that houses at least 1,500 detainees, likely many, many more. And the imagery reveals agricultural activities, which witnesses testify that they were forced to perform at that location. And so you begin to understand the methods that HRNK has used to to confirm many of these facilities, and we understand that this particular facility has existed since the 1960s, and since then its infrastructure has evolved. Okay, this is an image that shows the possible location of so-called Flower Hill, which is believed to be a mass grave at Cheongsan number 11. Former detainees testified that detainees who perish due to overwork or other crimes are buried there, and that it's called Flower Hill because flowers fertilized by the decaying corpses bloom there in the spring and in the summer. There are two other types of detention facilities in addition to the labor training camps. First, pretrial detention centers, where people suspected of even thinking about dissidents are taken for interrogation, often under torture. And second, holding centers, which typically house defectors, people suspected of illegal travel, homeless children, and people awaiting trial and sentencing. The geosat image on the screen shows 27 potential detention facilities that HRNK has identified so far. There's varying degrees of evidence supporting the existence of each facility, but there is credible evidence, including testimony from many former detainees, supporting the conclusion that each of the locations on that map is one of the three types of detention facilities that is the subject of this inquiry. Okay, what you see on the screen now is the organizational structure in which the detention facilities exist. The three white boxes at the bottom contain the 27 detention facilities that HRNK has identified, organized by type of facility. Pretrial detention first, then holding centers, then labor training camps. Pretrial detention and holding centers are believed to be administered by the Ministry of State Security, or MSS. The MSS conducts counterintelligence and internal security ops. It's responsible for investigating political crimes and runs the political prison system that was the subject of the 2017 inquiry. The Ministry of Social Security, or MPS, the acronym for its former name, the Ministry of People's Security, is believed to administer all three types of detention centers. The MPS is responsible for investigating non-political crimes. The MSS and the MPS are critical components of the North Korean internal security apparatus, which protects the regime through a system of constant surveillance, absolute control, and punishment. They both report directly to the State Affairs Committee, or the SAC. The SAC is the supreme policy body in North Korea. It exercises total administrative control over the MSS and the MPS, and it's chaired by the head of state. Also, the Organization and Guidance Department of the Korean Workers' Party exercises political control over the MSS and MPS. The KWP is the only political party in North Korea. The OGD oversees the political affairs of the KWP. It's known as the control tower and the heart of the North Korean political system. It has primary responsibility for ideological indoctrination, party organization, and political appointments. The KWP obviously exercises political control over the OGD, which is part of the KWP, and the chairman of the KWP is the head of state. As shown in the chart on the screen, there are reasonable grounds to conclude that the head of state and officials in the OGD, the SAC, the MPS, and the MSS may be subject to prosecution for crimes against humanity for all of the reasons that we've heard today. The operation of detention centers is an essential component of the program of control and internal repression that maintains North Korea's totalitarian regime. Authority and decision-making in that regime is dominated by the head of state and a handful of people that lead the SAC and the OGD. They exercise control over the MPS and the MSS, which directly administer the detention facilities in which credible evidence suggests crimes against humanity occur on a widespread and systematic basis. In understanding why criminal accountability needs to be investigated all the way up the chain of command, it's important to remember that international law, including as set forth in the Rome Statute, recognizes both individual responsibility as well as superior responsibility for failing to prevent and punish crimes. Civil society-led inquiries like this one can play a crucial role in galvanizing the international community to act, to achieve that accountability by promoting awareness and amplifying the voices of survivors. It's a privilege to be a part of this effort, which is so fundamental to what international law was meant to achieve. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nawi. Next, I'd like to invite Roberta Cohen to make a few remarks. Roberta is the co-chair emeritus of HRNK, and it's not in her title, and she would never put it in her title, but she's actually, I think, the godmother of the North Korean human rights movement here in the United States. So with that, Roberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. I've had a long career in human rights, humanitarian and refugee issues, which has spanned NGOs, the State Department, the United Nations, and the Brookings Institution. I find today's event a sterling example of the important role civil society can play in raising awareness to a critical issue, the need for accountability in North Korea. The International Bar Association, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, and the law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton have responded to the call of the United Nations to end the rampant impunity in North Korea, where so many men, women, and children have been subjected by their government to the most grave violations of human rights, crimes against humanity. Overseeing the proceedings today are 3 judges who could not be more accomplished in the pursuit of international justice. My own task was to examine information on hunger and starvation in the short-term detention facilities in North Korea, where detainees are typically held for up to 2 years. The UN Commission of Inquiry of 2014 provided extensive evidence on the deliberate denial of adequate food in long-term political prisons and re-education through labor camps. It also found systematic and widespread food denial in short-term facilities. In recent years, additional information has come to the fore about the short-term facilities. From the time of arrest through interrogation and detention, whether in police interrogation detention centers, state security interrogation detention centers, short-term labor facilities, or mobile forced labor brigades. The testimonies of many hundreds of former detainees compiled by NGOs and by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights evidence a deliberate and widespread efforts by officials of the state to use food as a weapon to control, punish, and even starve people to death. The detainees who gave testimonies came from many different locations in North Korea and spanned a 20-year period. Yet they all reported receiving a dangerously small fraction of the food adults need for minimum energy. They got, as Greg Kehoe mentioned, many, maybe 3 to 4 spoonfuls of corn soup or corn kernels or boiled leftovers 3 times a day. Many became physically sick from what they called the rotten, inedible food they were given, sometimes animal feed, nor did they regularly receive clean water. They suffered emaciation and became vulnerable to disease, including inflamed internal organs, interrupted menstrual cycles, tuberculosis, with children especially suffering and dying. Even when released, former detainees reported continuing physical and mental ailments, and there were countless deaths. Many witnessed in the detention centers deaths from starvation or from a combination of starvation, hard labor, beatings, and lack of medicine. A former administrator at a mobile labor brigade who was required to track the number of deaths at that facility said about 2,000 died each year from starvation and other causes. Those arrested on political or religious grounds suffered the worst punishment. such as being forced to drink dirty, contaminated water, or given reduced food, or none at all, to pressure them to incriminate others. Some were denied the food their own family members brought to enable them to survive. Even when expected to do hard labor, like cleaning railroads or agricultural work, they were denied adequate food. And if they didn't have the energy to complete the work assigned them, they were denied more food. One former detainee said he had to bury more than 200 in this labor facility. I have witnessed many people die of starvation, even though the state has food that could be distributed, said one former detainee. I think they willfully made people starve in detention, said another. I believe we have ample evidence to conclude that North Korean officials, from the highest level to the lowest, have been intentionally causing great suffering or serious injury to body or to mental and physical health, which is a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Governments and civil society should prepare for and press for future trials so that those responsible for the starvation of detainees and other crimes can be brought to justice. In the meantime, government should be raising awareness at the executive boards of UN agencies like the World Food Program and UNICEF, and also at the International Committee of the Red Cross and NGOs, so that when such organizations are back on the ground, they will seek to find ways to request access. The most acute cases of hunger and disease in the country can be found in these facilities. They merit the attention of the international humanitarian community and those involved with international criminal law. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to turn things over to David Tolbert. David is the former Deputy Chief Prosecutor at the ICTY and the former Executive Director at the International Center for Transitional Justice in New York. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Always a little bit of a challenge to be the last speaker in a long discussion. But I have found this to be experienced terrible crimes in Yugoslavia, massacres in Cambodia, genocide in Africa, and a number of other places. As I said in my remarks earlier that were taped, North Korea takes the cake. The level of crimes against humanity, the deprivation of people, and just the horrors that we've heard this morning, which is really only the tip of the iceberg of what's going on in North Korea. So I commend all of you for participating, particularly, obviously, the International Bar Association, Human Rights North Korea, the judges that have participated, all of whom I've known for a long time, and they've actually been even stronger, I think, than sometimes in the Yugoslavia Tribunal and others. The commitment they've had to continue this process, and we have faced so many issues and problems with COVID and having to repeatedly change the venue, the timing, and so forth. But I think this time today shows that we have overcome all these many of these obstacles, and all the disruption. And I think what we have produced, and very glad to see this group here, and hopefully a very large group online, to help galvanize this struggle for North Koreans who are suffering so badly. From my point of view, And I would defer, of course, to the great judges that we have, very experienced and some of the leading international judges in the country, in the world. But I read and looked at and studied almost all of the evidence myself. And I found this very extensive evidence to be not only strong, but really overwhelming. The evidence is robust, it's reliable, and I think the case is unanswerable. I look at that in my experience as working in 4 international tribunals. Of course, we all want to see serious crimes tried in the courts. We want them to see these perpetrators or those who are accused to meet the bar of justice. Obviously, in this case and others, that is a long way, is a long-term time away. And we don't always have the opportunity to bring the principal perpetrators to the bar of justice, both on the international level and on the national level. But I do think it's important to underline that while prosecutions and trials are essential, there are other tools as well to address the suffering of victims and the injuries that have occurred, and to try to provide healing and getting to the truth. This is broadly referred to as transitional justice. It includes important tools such as truth commissions, reparations processes, reforms, and they provide truth and remedies to victims, even if we are not able to have prosecutions. I think these work together under this rubric of transitional justice to provide solace to victims and help pin the most responsible for these crimes and these abuses, both from a moral and a legal point of view. We worked extensively on this and when I was president of the International Center for Transitional Justice. And I think we cannot forget these other processes as even in a situation like the former Yugoslavia, where we had a robust court, we were only able to prosecute a limited number of perpetrators. In all of these cases, though, whether we're talking about criminal justice, other transitional justice methods, reforming the countries that have experienced so much violations, so many violations, and so much damage, the leader of this almost exclusively is civil society. Governments are slow to act oftentimes. The United Nations and other international organizations are slow to act. It is civil society which drives these processes. They put pressure on the international community to take the steps necessary to address crimes against humanity and other serious crimes. This has been the case in our exercise today. I see this as an important, what we're doing today and the work that has been done to be part of that process. And what we're doing is helping to shine the light on these crimes, to give solace to the victims, and make the arc of impunity shorter. It's high time in the case of North Korea. High time is not, doesn't underline it sufficiently. It's way past time, maybe is a better way to put it. The international community should be, needs to be immediately addressing the crimes against humanity in detention centers in North Korea. This report that we are launching today contains a plethora of evidence. It is time that be taken seriously and steps be taken to relieve the enormous injuries, deaths, abuses, which are happening as we speak. Justice can be a long arc, but these efforts that we are making today, along with civil society and other actors, it is time to underline and provide a call to address these violations. We need to shorten the arc of justice. We need to ensure that the arc of justice bends towards accountability, and the sooner and the better. It's high time that the international community address the crimes against humanity that have been documented in this report and what you've heard, at least partially, of the work that's been done, although there is an enormous amount of work and evidence that is out there. It's a strong and pervasive and persuasive moral and legal case for action based on a very robust evidentiary basis, which you've heard partially today. It's exposed massive violations, and we need to work together, governments, civil society, and those of goodwill, to end this barbarity in North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that stirring finish to a very productive 90 minutes. Forgive me for not leaving time for Q&A. For those of you here in Washington, D.C., I'm sure our panelists would be happy to chat with you after the session concludes. With that, I would like to ask everybody to give a round of applause for our terrific panel. And finally, thank you for those of you who live stream. We very deeply appreciate your participation. It may be very late for you, especially if you're in Seoul or somewhere else far east. Thank you very much, and have a good day and a good evening.